Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is retired Vice Admiral Joseph Dyer, who is currently Chief Strategy Officer for the National Spectrum Consortium. He was a C-level executive at iRobot Corporation for over a decade. And formerly, he was the commander of the United States Navy's Naval Air Systems Command. Joe Dyer, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you today.
Well, I gave a very abbreviated bio just a moment ago. Could you please give our audience just a little bit more background about your long career?
Well, I'm happy to do so. I, at this stage in my life, multiplex my time between the National Spectrum Consortium as Chief Strategy Officer, as you were saying, and I also have a consulting practice that focuses at the intersection of technology, finance, and risk mitigation or risk optimization. A good bit of time with non-traditional and traditional defense companies, and a good bit of time in the venture capital world. So it's an exciting time in my life to draw from years of experience, starting out as an operational pilot, then Chief Engineer of Naval Aviation and the F-18 Program Manager, over to building robots for a decade at iRobot, as you mentioned. So I bring that background to our subject today, both with its goods and its biases.
Right. So as the commander of Naval Air Systems Command, among many other things, you were responsible for acquisition and procurement of naval aviation platforms. Could you talk a little bit more about that aspect of that role?
Sure. There are two, well, actually three, if you count what we used to call SPAWAR, now IWAR. But the two major systems commands are NAVC, which is responsible for surface Navy ships and weapons associated with ships, and then NAVAIR, which is all the aircraft, airborne systems, airborne weapons, and it's full spectrum from research, development, test and evaluation, and procurement activities as you related.
Right. And so this takes us into one of the main things that I wanted to talk to you about today, and that is the Section 809 panel project, which you were part of. Some people in our audience may be familiar with that project, but could you please give a background as to how that project came about, what it actually was, and the impetus behind the project?
I'm happy to do so. It was about a 2.5-year effort that started with the NDAA out of Congress. It was really one of the last activities that John McCain kicked off in his career before his health caused him to have to leave Washington.
And this was the 2016 NDAA, was it not?
Is in the 2016 NDAA, and then by the time the commissioners were selected and got up and got running was about a year after the NDAA, after the 16 NDAA. I like to lay a little background for the discussion about the 809 panel, and perhaps something that would be useful for us today would be to take a look back in our nation's history and see if we can find a time period, a year, that's analogous to where we find ourselves today. And you know, it's easier to find years that don't correspond than it is ones that you're confident do represent a similar point in time. But for sure, it's not 1918. No one is out to say peace in our times. The world has changed forever, and the future looks brighter after a difficult time. It's also not 1991. It's not the end of the USSR. It's not, again, a time of hope for peace in our times. But if you look at the years prior to both of those conflicts, World War I, World War II, you can start to find some analogies. Maybe 2014, maybe, 1914, maybe 1936, 37, 38. You can see the clouds of conflict starting together. You can see the potential for warfare. You can see the need to spin up industry and ready the armed forces for difficult times. So you bring that forward to today, we face a peer competitor, China, really for the first time in a long, long time. And that's a segue in to talk about our acquisition system, because today's acquisition system is a child of 75 years of dominance. While we've been able to enjoy those years of peace and the associated confidence that we could win big wars, certainly we've struggled with asymmetric and smaller wars, and that has been a difficult time, but they were never existential. We are entering a time where we've got real work to do for the first time in a long, long time. And if you look at our acquisition system and think about 75 years of dominance, you can see where many good things, many worthwhile things came into our acquisition system as part and parcel of social activities, of ensuring absolute fairness, of making the world a better place. And that was one of the kickoff cannons for the 809, was to look at how do we get speed, how do we get efficiency, and how do we recognize that we are in a very, very different time. And let me speak to that real quickly.
Yeah, sure.
We've had economic competition before. Think about Japan in the 80s when it seemed as though they could do nothing wrong and we could do nothing right. That was an economic competition. And we certainly had a military competition throughout the Cold War. But today's world with the US and China, we're facing something we've never faced before. And that is a combined economic and military challenge. And the two are integrated. Take China Telecom for a moment. China's communication system is a recipient of tremendous amount of commercial and government money, and it's being developed to service the commercial sector nationwide and worldwide, but it's also carrying a military adjunct for military comms. And that's where you start to see this joining of economics and defense that's part of today's China challenge.
I think your analogy is apt, storm clouds on the horizon that are reminiscent of some other times in our history. So the Section 809 panel, that presumably refers to a portion of the NDAA that was Section 809.
That's exactly right. Both the funding for the effort as well as the outline of what was to be accomplished was defined in that Appropriations Act, and it was the kickoff, again with a hat tip to Senator McCain. But it's one that when the panel fleshed out their charter as defined by the Congress, things that were on the list included the ever popular streamlining procurement, trying to find ways to do things more efficient, better, and faster. A strong look at the way the commercial sector buys, about the role that Amazon plays and how quick Amazon and associated commercial capabilities are vis-a-vis our government capability. We looked at barriers to entry. If you remember when Secretary Carter was in office, he kicked off what has become a major effort for the Department of Defense, and that was, how do we bring in non-traditional companies, build out our portfolio of suppliers beyond the big primes to build a customer relationship with companies that are very much leading the way in terms of new technology. Additive manufacturing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics. Not to say that the major primes can't and won't be a part of that, they certainly will be. But new, bright, quick ideas are coming from non-traditionals, and to look at the barriers from entry, both real and imagined, that tend to keep those people from doing business with us, was a major part of the 8 or 9 panel. A part I want to talk about a little bit today is also a refreshing look at not just everything that's gone wrong, but looking at some successful programs and to say, you know, maybe there's more to be learned by what worked than to have just another look at all the things that have gone wrong and should be fixed. But budgets and how it's distributed, IT acquisitions, all these things were part of what was taken up by some 17 commissioners. And I will tell you, if I could roll back the clock, I would change some things about the 809 panel. Of the 17 commissioners, the vast majority of them came from either legal or contracts background. Mm-hmm. And we worked hard at the stand-up to get in a few people that were from the program side and that focused on not process, but product. And that theme of focusing on product is a cause that was taken up throughout the 8 or 9 panel. In addition to myself, Dave Ahern, a longtime OSD leader in AT&L, was part of that. Dr. Bill LaPlante, who's now at Draper Labs as the director, but was the Air Force Acquisition Executive, and Lieutenant General Ken Merchant, who is at Lockheed working supply chain. Those people joined 809, and I think were key to some of the successes and successful recommendations that are still over time being taken up by the department. We'll talk about some of those, but right. Real success, I think, or real breakthrough thinking did come from the product side.
When did the panel conclude? The 2018-19 timeframe?
Working through 19, I think the shutdown was actually like December of 19, and a little bit of wrap-up work even into 20. But certainly 18 and 19 were the heavy lift years.
What are some of the major recommendations and foot stomps that you perceived out of this effort? And it may be a little bit early to tell whether or not it's making a difference, but could you comment on that as well?
17 commissioners, if you ask the other 16 to give you the high points, you'd get a different list based upon their backgrounds and perspectives, but I'll certainly share mine with you. If you read government contracts today, you'll find an awful lot of things that don't help. You'll find the requirement that, believe it or not, this is in today's defense contracts. You will provide vending machines that accept $1 coins. You will ensure that each of the supply chain subcontractors can certify that there's no sex trafficking. Look, I promise you, I'm not pro-sex trafficking, but does that really help us get prepared for years that are going to be challenging in front of us, or is it just overhead? There are many, many, many of those that were part of what folks would call clearing the underbrush. It's appropriate, but not appropriate for defense procurement. And there's also this very rigorous process description of this is how you will do business. Born, no surprise, of the ascendancy of power of contracting officers and legal, and frankly, the erosion of power over the last couple of decades of program managers. So shifting the pendulum from process to product, where products that can fight and win and deliver capability into the hands of the warfighter was a special focus of the panel. And this belief that we had to better balance the power of government program managers vis-a-vis their commercial counterparts. And a great description of that problem came from one of the, actually a Boeing vice president, manager of one of the large programs, who said, on our side of the table, we can decide and commit resources. On the government side of the table, the program manager has to take a note and go back home and ask mother, may I? So you've got the potential for decision-making and speed on one side, but not on the other. To try and bring that into greater balance is one of the things we were much about.
One of the historical dynamics that it seems like we are trying to avoid, and the 809 panel seems like it is aimed at trying to avoid this historical pitfall, is accidentally fighting the last war today. Would you say that that's right?
I would absolutely agree with that. And that's a good segue in to talk a little bit about successful programs.
Yeah,
we looked at some 15 or 16 programs, just to name a few, the AIM-9X, the IR missile program, the B-2, which came out of the black world, but certainly was an acquisition success, P-3A, the new patrol plane out of Boeing replacing P-3, Virginia-class submarine, those kinds of programs. And let me share what I think is an interesting fact about failed and successful programs with you for a moment. If you envision a bathtub curve, long flat bottom and steep sides on both left and right, one of the things the panel recognized is that we find dispatch, we find speed, we find decisions made on the two extremes. Certainly, when programs are in trouble, you get an awful lot of senior decision maker attention. For big programs that are doing well, same's true. You get a lot of time with major decision makers, with the procurement executives, with the undersecretaries and the secretaries. Both of these cases, the good and the bad, get an awful lot of attention and dispatch. But the long, flat middle just has to work their way through the bureaucracy. And to better delegate and to restructure the approach to acquisition management is probably the major recommendation, in large tribute to Dave Ahern, by the way. And to start that discussion, let me give you some free financial advice. The free financial advice is invest in a basket of stocks, a portfolio, and don't put all your money into just one or two stocks, because there is serious risk mitigation to be found in managing your own money or government procurements from a portfolio perspective, as opposed to a head down, butt up look at one or two programs. Frankly, we manage many defense programs, certainly those on the long bottom of the flat tub, of the bathtub, as though they were standalones. And one of the right criticisms that the Congress applies to DoD is you don't look left and right and figure out how to manage a portfolio that, using my financial example again, would embrace some programs with higher risk but higher payoff, that would have a solid foundation of core strength, and would cross the gamut of how we do business. So let me talk about portfolios from two perspectives, and let me tell you about why I worry that some of this, while it's starting to find traction and you're starting to see the words in today's NDAA, in both 2021 and taking shape in 22, you will see this theme of portfolios starting to take hold. And let me describe both aspects of it. At the top level, at the top of DoD, there needs to be an architect for the future. Somebody, and organizationally, that's the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, but somebody has to look out 10, 12, 15, even 20 years and say what technologies are coming and where should we invest. Just looking out that far is critically important, and something that we don't do well, because the pressures of budgets, finance, the Hill, and the press tends to draw us in very close. So to look across all the services and all the capability in terms of where it is today, to envision and drive toward a future capability is what we call enterprise portfolio management. Where should we go, and what is the vector to get us there? That requires somebody with real strength. And this, by the way, is the one that I worry about a little bit. Many of us, me included, were happy to see the services start to take more power in acquisition in today's world than was true just a couple of years ago, with the exception of literally a handful of major programs like Joint Strike Fighter. Program management is delegated now to the services. and that's closer to product. That's closer to where real work is done. There's goodness to be said about it, but it makes this long-term architecture problem harder, not easier. Now let's talk about portfolio management closer to today's world. If you look at a service, a procurement executive officer, and a stable of program managers managing typically 4, 5, 6, even more programs, you see the same problem we talked about before in terms of speed and authority. Today's PEO can't really move money from one program that's not doing well to one that is tremendously promising, but needs more resources to spur it along. So as we called for more architecture for the future in enterprise program management, at the lower level, think about service, PEO, program managers, and down, we said we need to give them more authority to take quick action, analogous to that discussion I relayed a while ago about the commercial program manager can make a decision and get on with it, but on our programmatic side in today's world, it's like a committee meeting. And working our way through that is part of what we think is critically important.
Wow. Yeah. So thanks for that, Joe. You really painted the picture and illuminated the challenge of scarce resources and trade-offs and being able to look into the future and have a variety of investments that try to cover all contingencies, and then overlay on top of that the political climate and the relatively near-term outlook of political actors, by design in our system, where politicians are typically just looking 2 years ahead to try to maintain their perch on power. But all of this mixes together into a very hard problem to try to manage national security risk.
Well, it does indeed. We talked to one of the undersecretaries during the 809 panel about this need to transition from process to product. And he had an idea that was funny in first blush, but wasn't that funny when you stop to think about it. He said, we really should take the Federal Acquisition Regulation, thousands of pages, stamp it with a fake top secret, and leave it on the steps of the Chinese embassy. He says, if that won't bring them to their knees, nothing will.
What, try to bait the Chinese government to adopt our own regulations as if it's the best way to do business in the 21st century?
Have them take up crippling process as being on the path to doing anything both capable and new.
Right. The Chinese apparently, this is a very simplistic way of looking at some of the dynamics, but according to many, the Chinese are very good at stealing stuff, and so if we can fool them into stealing our bureaucratic processes, that would be a big win for us, right? As we're trying to pivot away from that.
It would be crippling. John, let me touch on one other piece of important work that I think, most important work that I think the 809 panel also took up. And that was looking at readiness and in-service support. The supporting our systems with spares, with depots, with overhauls, maintenance, actually consumes 70% of our defense budget that goes into hardware and software. only about 30% goes into research, development, and production. So the big money is post-delivery of a new airplane or a new missile or a new capability. There is tremendous system attention to development and to production. If you have a program going off the rails in development, then you will see the Department of Defense, the Hill, coming after you with what's called the Nunn-McCurdy breach, which is a big slap on the wrist that says this isn't going well and you best fix it, our heads are going to roll. So there's real focus on the development. At the same time in production, and you can see this today with F-35, if things aren't going well in production in terms of either cost or schedule, then the defense press will make it a cause célèbre, as they should. But there's great attention to development and to production. There's just not an equal or equivalent or even close focus on the decisions that predetermine readiness. And consequently, you can neglect it. You can steal money from what should be good preparatory work for development. And you start to see things like naval aviation suffered through over the last 10 or really 15 years. And that is full systems capable readiness that dropped 30 or even 40 percentage points because money was taken from this important investment in maintaining the material condition of our system and spent where the visibility was, if it wasn't attended to, in development and procurement. And you'll sometimes hear people say things like, well, just buy the airplanes and we'll get a shadow on the ramp, and then the Hill will have to fund the maintenance and spares for those systems later. They never say this, but subliminally, the word is hold them hostage for it. So two of the other things that you see out of the 809 panel was to say, Mr. Program Manager, Mr. Architect, nothing is as important as doing good work at the conceptual phase of a program or systems development, because that's when you define not only what it does and how well it does and how long it will take and what it will cost. That's also where you look at how difficult it is to maintain, how reliable it will be, and you start to whittle away at the 70% of our spend that is so expensive today that it is robbing us of the funds we need to recapitalize. So these portfolio management, both at the Uber level and at the program, at the PEO's level, and this focus on readiness, I think are three of the most important parts that we've seen out of 809.
What I'm getting from what you were just saying there, Joe, is that there are some tectonic shifts happening where the old ways of managing portfolios or keeping programs alive by strategically contributing information or withholding information. Basically, the procurement mechanisms within the government are well understood by the players, and each player has incentives, and each player has levers that they can throw in order to manage things in their favor, and it's all kind of a mess. And so the 809 panel is trying to illuminate and make some suggestions to adapt this into more of a product focus context that's appropriate for the 21st century. Do you sense now that there's this, growing sense of urgency that we, the United States and perhaps the West in general, need to turn the page quickly on these types of, I don't know, I mean, this is my word, but this kind of like a sclerotic bureaucracy, and, quickly transition into something that is going to be more nimble and effective? Would you say that that's a fair take on everything that you've been saying?
I would. And I would go back to our beginning, John, when we talked about what year is it? If it's 1936, we're already late to the party. And I think we are going to find positive and necessary changes in defense acquisition, driven foremost by the advent of a peer competitor. Would we do it without that? Probably not.
Right.
And let's tie it also, tie your description of just a minute ago to non-traditional companies. If you are a Boston or Silicon Valley or Rockville high-tech company with capability that is desperately needed to defend the nation and to find its way into our toolboxes for the future, if you are that non-traditional company operating on venture capital money, as an example, and you look at this decision by committee, this thousands of pages of process on behalf of government procurement and defense procurement, if you are a non-traditional, you look at this and say, whoa, I'm a patriot, but do I want to be part of that? We have to reshape our world where the new capabilities that will be key and essential to winning or losing going forward want to do business with us.
Yeah, for sure. I recommend to our Cognitive Crucible audience, we've had a number of podcasts that have talked about aligning our efforts more with the commercial sector and the notion of innovation in general. And we will have links to those discussions, along with a link to the reports from the Section 809 panel in the show notes for everybody to go and check out. They're definitely worth your time and effort to read and consume. So, Joe, I'd like to switch gears just a little bit and talk a little bit more about your current efforts, and they're directly relevant to everything that we've been talking about. But as we mentioned at the top of the discussion, you're the Chief Strategy Officer for the National Spectrum Consortium. And it looks like this outfit is involved in all kinds of tech relevant to the information environment. And this is just a small sampling, but 5G, Internet of Things, industrial Internet of Things, edge computing, autonomy, much more. Could you take just a moment and tell our audience, what the National Spectrum Consortium is, and how do you think it nests into the problem with the information warfare, the information, managing the information environment and cognitive security?
Well, thanks for an opportunity to talk to that. The National Spectrum Consortium is really, again, funded out of the Congress. It's an interesting undertaking because many of us have spent our lives either in government programs or in industry with good ideas looking for money. The National Spectrum Consortium is money looking for good ideas. And that funding dominantly comes from a portion of the spectrum auctions where the government sells off spectrum, and there is a portion of that comes to the consortium and to the government to answer the question, well, how are we going to do that? If you go back just a few years, you'll see two things that we've thankfully gotten past. The first was a belief that we were running out of spectrum. Spoiler alert, we're not running out of spectrum, because if you look at the individual pipes through which communication flows, most of them are empty all the time. And if you were to use a internet analogy where you could multiplex and take full advantage of what would otherwise be a pipe with no flow, we have plenty of spectrum, but it takes advanced technology to utilize it all. The other piece, and this has been thankfully a growth decision for DoD, is the belief of just a few years ago that they had to own their spectrum in totality, such that no one could interfere, because after all, this is national defense. That's what led to an awful lot of the empty pipes. DoD today is recognizing that they can share spectrum and that the technology will support it. So let's go over and talk about 5G for a minute. 5G is much in the news, and you know the bumper sticker is that, wow, you can download a high definition, full-length movie in 1.2 seconds. I mean, that's amazing by today's standards. It's literally an order of 3 orders of magnitude faster than today's service. But there's much more to it. The peak rate is faster and much higher density. That's one way that more spectrum is available. It's very low latency. The latency in 4G is about 10 milliseconds. And that's down an order of magnitude to 1 millisecond for 5G. So now things like remote surgery, now things like long distance ability to link together a anechoic chamber at Patuxent River with aircraft in it, with missiles on the rack or on the bench at China Lake that are playing with ships at sea in a Pacific Missile Test Range. Low latency starts to open up those windows for us. The security and the reliability architecture of 5G is a giant step forward. There's an issue with 4G on the move, in that it won't support anything that's faster, moving faster than something just over 200 knots. So 5G increases that speed now to over 300 and will further improve that over time. If you think about knowing who is where in other environments or back up the GPS, 5G has the potential to geolocate within about 3 feet. Whereas if you see today's world with 4G, again, an order of magnitude less than that. And maybe the last one I'll mention is 5G can handle big city, multiple receiver transmitters within a very small area. The capability to put multiple devices, and you probably have within reaching distance of your home, you've probably got over a dozen right now, and that's going to grow tremendously over time. So 5G brings an awful lot of capability that we've talked about on the technical domain, but let me tell you the kind of change it's going to bring to our economy. I like to use autonomous automobiles and look at a 5G future where every automobile knows where every other automobile is within just a few feet. It knows its closure, its closest point of approach, and you are now going to see a tremendous improvement in safety and a tremendous reduction in the number of collisions. So you can see that, but let's talk about the impact it's going to have on our economy. As we get 5G and autonomous vehicles deployed, you're going to see this improvement in safety. And it's easy to see where body shops are going to be disrupted. Don't go in the body shop business, John, because there's going to be much less demand for it. But you know who's really going to be disrupted? The insurance companies, because the insurance business as we know it today is going to change dramatically as 5G and subsequent architectures come into play, both technically and economically. So these are big changes that are going to be part of our future. And I cannot pass up, John, one more foot stomp at telling you that it is in many cases the non-traditional companies that are doing the most exciting work in 5G.
Well, thank you for that that 101 on 5G. Actually, that may have been a little bit more than a 101. I have a much better understanding of 5G than I did a few moments ago. I could ask all kinds of follow-on questions. One that I missed your explanation. How does 5G do so much of a better job of geolocating? That I don't quite understand the connection between the technology and being more accurate with geolocation.
So I will, I'll use some poetic license to try and explain that very briefly. Think of an early warning radar with a very long pulse that can identify location, but with tremendous uncertainty because that pulse is so long. On the 5G side, it's like a high pulse rate where you're able to sense and measure location at a very, with very high discrimination.
Okay, fair enough. Wow, that is outstanding.
Read that. You're looking through a telescope instead of looking through a wide angle lens.
I see. And if you have multiple sensors which are triangulating on the same object, then you get a more precise location based upon that phenomenon.
You got it.
Huh, okay, great. So just one more overlay on 5G. So you started the 5G discussion with, there's all kinds of stuff in the news about 5G, and you recapped some of the technological and economic advantages or improvements that we might be able to expect over the next few years. But where does the national security urgency come in relative to 5G? I mean, it's just about any article you look at, 5G and China are a part of the same discussion. Could you illuminate that national security dynamic for us just a little bit?
Let me try and explain it this way. With 4G, you've got a very small toolbox. And there's some things that are not, there's some tools that we want and need that you don't find capably in the 4G toolbox. There are things like security, robustness, the ability to run private networks with easier architectural employment than is in the case with 4G. It's the difference between a slide rule and an advanced calculator. If you're if you're like me and lived through that engineering evolution, it is just a much bigger toolbox with much more capability within. Perhaps the most important part of that is having a real architecture that can take on cyber and security. And that ties back to China and our adversaries. And it also ties back to the need to operate anywhere in the world using any portion of spectrum that's available.
It's all a two-sided coin. There's the glorious improvements that are possible for all of our technology advances, which promise all kinds of wonderful things for humanity and helping us navigate through some of these global challenges. But then the other side of the coin is it introduces additional national security worry and changes the competitive landscape in ways that are difficult, at least for us, the United States, to pivot and address. So all of that is bundled up into this conversation between the Section 809 panel project and these various different technological projects that you're working on with National Spectrum Consortium.
Yes.
So I'd like to wrap up, Joe, if I may, and ask you if you could recommend a book or other online resource to our audience that they might not know about, which they would also appreciate.
Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, a new book out of several months now from last year, Leadership in Turbulent Times. And she goes through the early life, the midlife challenges, and the accomplishments of 4 presidents: Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, and Lyndon Johnson. And the takeaway from that book for me was how lucky we are to have people that come to the fore at important times. And also a great review, even a set of checklists for leadership capabilities or techniques. And the reader comes away with a recognition that there are many different styles of leadership, and they have to be tailored to the times. But I would strongly recommend Leadership in Turbulent Times, John, to your audience.
All right, and we will have links to that book and other resources in the show notes. And Admiral Joe Dyer, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you, John.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.